Polytech M14S. This gun is one of the most straightforward Chinese clones of a famous American battle rifle. It was manufactured at State Arsenal 356 in Kunming, China, then imported into the United States through Poly Technologies, or Norinco, starting in 1988, until import bans took effect in the early 1990s. Now, let's review the specifications. It is chambered for .308 Winchester /7.6 2x51 NATO, matching the caliber of the original United States EM-14. Early examples brought in before a 1989 ban sometimes retain bayonet lugs and slotted flash suppressors, features directly carried over from United States patterns. Later imports adapted to regulations with non-slotted flash suppressors and rubber recoil pads replacing military trapdoor butt plates. The receiver and operating rod were forged, and the barrel was chrome-lined. Forged receivers concentrate strong steel in critical structures, and chrome-lined barrels improve corrosion resistance and bore longevity under regular firing. That combination of chambering and materials means that, aside from some metric pattern threading and furniture differences, many parts interchange with United States-made M14 type rifles. Side-stamped rifles have markings below the rear sight, while heel-stamped rifles have markings on the upper rear of the receiver. The 1994 executive order banning firearms from China ended fresh imports, solidifying the M14/S's place in United States collector and shooter circles as a short-lived but unmistakably American pattern rifle made abroad. Norinco CQ5, a Chinese rifle built as an unlicensed variant of the American M16A1, first introduced in the early 1980s by Norinco's subsidiary, Sichuan Changqing Machine Works. Its purpose was to offer a Western pattern 5.56 by 4 5mm rifle to export customers rather than to replace China's own service rifles, which continued to favor indigenous designs like the Type 56 and later the QBZ series. What makes the CQ a clone in concrete terms is how much of the original M16A1's functional architecture it preserves. The rifle is chambered for 5.56 by 4 5mm NATO, uses a gas-operated system with a rotating bolt, and feeds from 20 or 30-round magazines compatible with the STANAG standard, the same basic mechanics and cartridge family as the M16. The dimensions line up, too. Overall length sits around 986 mm with a 508 mm 20-inch barrel and an empty weight near 2.9 kilograms, situating it in the same practical size class as its American predecessor. Even where the CQ differs, the contrast highlights its root design. Norinco used 6000 series aluminum alloy for the receiver instead of the 7075 series, which is lighter and cheaper, but less corrosion-resistant. The rifle also sports a ribbed handguard, a revolver-style pistol grip, and a buttstock shape that diverge visually from the classic M16 profile, but these changes sit atop the same operational foundation. Another telling spec is the 1-in-12 rifling twist rate in the barrel, tuned to stabilize the older M19355 grain bullet rather than the heavier SS109/M 855 NATO rounds, a choice that reflects the M16A1 era the design is copying. Because of these aligned mechanics, dimensions, and ammunition compatibility, historians and analysts describe the CQ as a purposeful, functional copy of the American M16A1 rather than a distant derivative. Norinco CQ-A, China's attempt to build a carbine in the mold of the American M4A1, and the way its core specifications and layout track that goal is why it gets talked about as a clone. Unlike the base CQ rifle, with a full 20-inch barrel that traces back to the M16A1 design, the CQ-A is the carbine variant introduced around 2006 at international expos, featuring a telescoping stock, detachable carrying handle, and a 14.5-inch barrel, directly echoing the standard United States M4 profile. The CQ-A is chambered in 5.56 by 4 5mm NATO .223 Remington, the same intermediate cartridge as the M4. Its chrome-lined 14.5-inch barrel and ambidextrous magazine release mark it as a short-barrel carbine suited to modern roles rather than a full-length rifle. Many listings also note a 1-in-9 rifling twist, a practical choice that stabilizes both lighter M193 and heavier SS109/M855 bullets, matching what Western service carbines aim for. The overall length spans about 785 to 880 millimeters, depending on stock position. And it takes 30-round STANAG magazines, exactly the standard that made the AR pattern ecosystem interoperable across NATO and allied forces. That combination of chambering, magazine standard, and adjustable stock places the CQ-A in the same functional role as the M4A1 rather than as a distant relative. Even where Norinco diverges, the contrast highlights the design's origin. The handguard and front sight block differ in shape, but they sit on a receiver and control layout that a user familiar with an EM4 will recognize instantly. The CQ-A isn't just inspired by the M4. It deliberately adopts the short barrel carbine format and key interface points that define that American design. Norinco NP22. Standing out because it was explicitly patterned on the Sig Sauer P226, one of the most successful Western service pistols of the 1980s and 1990s. In firearms references, the NP22 is described as Chinese-made copies of the P226 design made for export markets rather than for licensed production. Take a look at the specifications. It is chambered for 9x19mm parabellum, like the P226. Standard NP22 listings note a 4.4-inch barrel matched with trigger operation, a decocking lever, and a chrome-lined barrel, all characteristics carried straight from the service pistol pattern that SIG popularized. Many catalog descriptions also highlight an aluminum alloy frame with 3-dot sights and provisions for accessories, showing how Norinco adopted not just the cartridge and action, but the practical control layout of the P226 family. Calling the NP22 a clone isn't merely about looks. It is about functional mimicry. The same cartridge class, the same operating mechanism, and features like the decocker and firing pin block arranged in a familiar sequence. Compared to completely unrelated designs, the NP22's parts and controls are close enough that many shooters see a straight lineage from the original SIG pattern to this Chinese version. Where details differ, such as finish quality or minor ergonomics, those are surface-level choices, not fundamental departures from the P226 template. In other words, the NP22's design deliberately aligns its key functional points with the classic Western pattern, and that alignment is why historians and reviewers explicitly refer to it as a clone built on the Sig Sauer P226 model. Norinco Model 97. And this one gets called a clone for a simple reason. It recreates the Winchester Model 1897 experience, not just the outline. The Winchester 1897 is defined by an exposed external hammer, a slide pump action, and a tubular magazine under the barrel. That combination is the whole point of the gun. Most descriptions of the Norinco 97 focus on the same identifiers. It is commonly sold in the riot or trench-style configuration, and one review describes the riot model as a relatively plain clone of the Winchester 1897 with a 20-inch barrel, a bead sight, and a 5-round tube magazine. Those details matter because they match the 1897's most recognizable close-range setup, the version people picture when they hear Model 97. Gun tests. Flat out calls the Norinco Model 97 a close copy of the Winchester 1897, then adds the reality check that many parts do not interchange. That is the clean framing, same core layout and operating feel, built as a reproduction, with compatibility depending on the specific part and the specific gun. Norinco 1911, a 1 pattern. People call this product a clone for 3 checkpoints you can verify on the pistol: the control layout, the operating system, and the government size envelope. Start with the controls. It keeps the classic 1911 set. A shooter expects to touch in the same order: a frame-mounted thumb safety, a grip safety, a slide stop, and a straight single-action trigger. The platform runs Browning short recoil operation with a tilting barrel, the defining recipe of the M1911 and M1911A1 family. Size is the third tell. The common Norinco 1911A1 format sits in the government lane with a 127mm barrel and a single-stack 7-round magazine, usually chambered in 45 ACP. That choice keeps the same balance and timing people associate with the United States service pistol pattern. Why does this clone stay in conversations decades later? Builders treated it as a GI pattern base gun. A long-running 1911 forum thread describes forged parts, and another review notes custom pistol builders buying Norincos in volume during the 1980s for competition projects. Hawk Industries, Hawk 982. The Remington 870 set the template in 1950, a tube-fed pump shotgun that became a default in American homes, cruisers, and hunting camps. The Hawk 982 enters the story decades later as a Chinese-made pump that American buyers immediately measured against that 870 template. The clone label forms in public the same way most gun reputations form. Owners tried to fit common 870 furniture, and then reported what worked. A Shotgun World thread from June 28, 2009 already treats the 982 alongside the 870 in the same breath, discussing finish wear and stock fit as comparable points of reference. By January 10, 2010, The High Road thread documents a user installing a Remington 870 barrel on a Hawk 982 with a spacer solution, which shows the conversation had moved from looks to geometry and parts alignment. A 2017 cheaper-than-dirt post calls the Hawk 982 a Chinese-made Remington 870 clone and frames it as a budget substitute built on the same pattern. IMFDB summarizes the Hawk shotgun series as primarily patterned after the Remington 870 and explicitly calls the Norinco 982 a Chinese clone of the 870. Norinco Type 97. July 1, 1997, put the QBZ-95 family in front of the world during the Hong Kong changeover ceremony, after China had already adopted the rifle in 1995. The export offshoot becomes the Type 97 story, and the copy label follows one visible interface choice. These civilian variants were built to accept STANAG magazines, the AR-15 and MC-16 magazine standard. That choice pulls the rifle into American orbit, even when the layout stays bullpup. The action and magazine sit behind the trigger, so the handling philosophy remains QBZ family. The magazine interface points the other direction. Small Arms Review notes that accommodating STANAG magazines required a push-button-style magazine catch, and a Canadian review describes the Type 97 NSR using a traditional AR-15-style magazine release. Viewers recognize that as copying because it borrows the part of the AR ecosystem that decides logistics and compatibility. The public blowback has a clear timestamp. In Canadian parliamentary evidence, a witness describes the RCMP reclassifying the Norinco Type 97 as prohibited and sending letters to 50 owners telling them to turn the guns in. Norinco M305. This is an M14 pattern rifle made for the civilian export market. The United States adopted the M14 in 1957 as a 7.6 2x51 NATO service rifle, and its identity comes from the Garand lineage, a rotating bolt driven by an operating rod, fed by a detachable box magazine. Canadian and shooter-facing sources describe the M305 in plain language, a Chinese copy of the American M14 sold as a semi-auto 7.6 2x51 rifle. Import histories place Norinco and Polytech M14 type rifles in Canada starting in the early 1990s, then mention later receiver imports in the 2000s through Canadian importers. A United States Archive discussion treats the Canadian M305 as an M14 type rifle and calls out recognizable M14 pattern cues on some examples, including a slotted flash suppressor and a scope mount recoil lug. The M305 is built to sit inside the M14 mental model, same caliber class, same external language, same family of parts and the accessories people associate with the pattern. When buyers talk about it, they talk in M14 terms because the rifle is asking to be judged in M14 terms. A K-47S legend. Late 1988 is where the legend's U.S. story locks in. Collector discussions and serial prefix notes describe the Legend series as arriving from late 1988 and running into the 1989 import ban, and they call out the signature feature people use to label it a copy: a milled receiver. Listings and auction descriptions repeat the same window, often dating examples to 1988 to 1989 and describing them as short-run pre-ban imports. The clone accusation attaches to a specific template. AK collectors describe the Polytech legend as close to the old-school Chinese Type 3 style, meaning the milled receiver AK-47 pattern people associate with early Kalashnikov production. The gun's identity stays anchored in that pattern, 7.62x39, chambering, semi-auto export configuration, and a receiver construction style that telegraphs Type 3 the moment the rifle is in your hands. Guns and Ammo points out that a $500 Polytech Legend in 1989 later sold for several thousand, and it treats the Legend as a standout among Chinese AK imports. That is the quiet timeline for this one. Late 1988 to 1989, Americans buy it as an AK-47 style rifle, the import door narrows, and the Legend gets frozen as a milled receiver AK copy people still chase. If you want to understand why these firearms are consistently labeled clones, stay with the next articles, where each model is directly compared to its Western original. Save this piece, share it with fellow enthusiasts, and follow along for deeper, side-by-side technical breakdowns and historical context.